Hello, everyone. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you all for being here this morning after last night. It's good to see so many sprightly faces. But I also wanted to extend a big thank you to the Unimutual team for inviting me here to speak today on this really important topic and a topic that's really close to my heart. I'm very excited today to get to share this experience with you. And I hope that as we go through today, that we can all take something away and about our communities and how to make our communities more inclusive and embracing of absolutely everyone. At the very core of my practice is this belief that that belonging, community, and connection are really what we're all seeking, and that if we can achieve that in our communities, then we'll all be better places for that. So before we begin, I just wanted to offer a few disclaimers though. Firstly, I'm not a medical professional. In fact, I've only been in my professional career now for going on 4 years. So I started off at Grace College in 2023 as the assistant dean, and now I've moved into the role of associate dean. But with that, as far as my knowledge in this area goes, I have lived with a diagnosis of ADHD and a few other neurodivergent conditions for a few years. I received my first diagnosis around 4 years ago, and have been living with it my entire life as well. So all my knowledge today is based off my lived experience as a neurodivergent individual. But I might also say there that everyone's experience is unique to them and deserving of being affirmed. So I by no means speak for everyone's lived experience, but that is where most of my knowledge is coming from today. I would also love that if you have any questions, that you please keep them to the end or try and catch me afterwards. I'm going to try and leave some time for questions, but just so that we don't go off the rails, because I could spend forever talking about this topic, but I know that I only have 45 minutes today. So yes, happy to chat more afterwards. So yeah, as I said today, I hope that we broadly gain this understanding of what neurodiversity is, develop an awareness of the unique needs, challenges, and strengths that neurodivergent individuals possess and what they can contribute to our communities, and explore a range of inclusive and neuro-affirming strategies to meaningfully support our students and indeed our colleagues and ourselves within our workplaces. So a little bit about me. I want to start off on the story of how I came to realize that I was neurodivergent. And for that, I'm going to take you all back to this wonderful year of 2020, which was 5 years ago now, half a decade ago. It's wild to think. But we all remember it well, the pandemic, and seemingly not just of COVID, but also seemingly at the same time, this boom of ADHD diagnoses. I like to talk about it as not just the year of the spicy cough, but also the year of the spicy brain. And this is where the puzzle pieces for me all started to fall into place. I remember it well. I was there in my third year of college, and in the first 4 weeks, we went from having a community of 350 people to 20 people. And I was one of those 20 who stayed and didn't go home during that time. And so it was a massive disruption to the way of life that I'd known for the past 3 years before that, and also the learning environment that I'd set up. And so as for all of us, we had to adapt and change how we did things, and that included the learning model largely. And I thought that given this stripped back, this lack of community that had supported me the past few years, that this was going to be a really challenging year for me. But surprisingly, it was for me, it was the year that I actually ended up performing my best academically. It was the first semester that I ever got 7s and high distinctions in most of my courses. At first I was thinking, oh, why is this the case? Maybe it's because there's less distractions. There's no people here to distract me, convince me to go on nights out. Perhaps that's it. Perhaps it was, but then that I look at second semester, and I was able to maintain those grades up into second semester as well when everyone returned, and we had more events in one semester than arguably we did in across the entire year as well. And so I think back to what actually was it about this time that enabled me to do so well and supported me to do so well academically during this period. And I think back to the support that was put in place. All of a sudden there was this understanding, this global understanding that we were all in this together, and this was a challenge for all of us. Universities largely adapted to that, making everything much more flexible. We moved to online learning, but when it came to assessments as well, there was much more consideration around extra time for extensions, extra support for students as well, reaching out to tutors, course coordinators, and the like. We fast forward then to the following year, 2021. And I'm back in college. This is my final year now, and everything is essentially back to normal. And that includes the traditional way of learning, apart from a few remaining online courses. But all of a sudden, the inaccessibility to support services returned. The rigid ways of thinking about productivity returned, and the same old expectations that we placed on students. And during this year, I actually burnt out entirely. During first semester, I failed most of my courses. And in second semester, I ended up dropping out of my courses before I could repeat the same mistakes as I did in semester one. And so how did I go from achieving the best grades that I ever had during a global pandemic to, as soon as life returned back to normal, crashing and burning down the road? And for me, I realized very quickly that there was something else going on in my brain. And that little thing was revealed to me by a little clock app, TikTok, that we all know and love. And found out, started seeing content on other people's lived experience with ADHD. Also having been exposed to lots of my friends who were diagnosed ADHD prior as well. And that's when we started having these conversations, me, my GP, my psychologist, about a possible diagnosis around ADHD. Now, the Australian Psychological Society says that it responds to, in terms of why we observed this massive jump during the pandemic, why all of a sudden everyone has ADHD. They predict that over 366 million adults globally have ADHD. That's surpassing anxiety, which was the previously most diagnosed mental health condition. Medication since 2019 has more than doubled for ADHD. And there's this global consensus really that the frequency of ADHD is actually not increasing, but that the diagnosis rate is. That all of a sudden, these factors that include the historic underdiagnosis and a rise in awareness thanks to the clock app like TikTok, and the lessening of stigma have contributed to a much more understanding view of what ADHD is, and allowed and enabled people to actually go seek proper support. So it brings me to this term of neurodiversity. So who in the room has heard of neurodiversity before? Just a show of hands. Lovely, okay, most of you, that's good. So neurodiversity is a sociological term. It's not a scientific term, but it generally just describes that the naturally occurring variation and differences that we observe in neurological functions that exist amongst all human beings. So in this room, we are all neurodiverse. We all have different neurotypes. We all think differently. When it comes to how we think, we tend to categorize by neurotypical, which is used to describe the neurological characteristics and functions considered to be the norm or typical amongst the general population, and neurodivergent. And this captures a range of learning disorders, other conditions such as ADHD, autism, that aren't considered typical, but equally valid and affirming, equally valid and deserving of being affirmed as neurotypical individuals. When we look at this kind of idea of neurotypical, neurodiverse, I like to bring up, because it is a sociological term, the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability. Whereas the medical model of disability would describe and kind of characterizes people that are disabled because of their differences, the social model of disability says that disability is caused by the way that society is built, not by an individual's differences. So that essentially that the barriers that exist within society can be removed so that people, for lack of a better word, become less disabled, or so that they are more easily able to access the world around them. Whereas the medical model of disability would say that that person's disabilities and their differences must be fixed in order for them to access the world around them. Neurodiversity as a neurodivergence as a sociological term covers a range of different conditions, but these are just a few of the most common up here. So we all know ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. It also covers a range of acquired neurodivergence. So this can include things like head traumas, concussions, things that change the way that our brains work, as well as emotional trauma and childhood trauma as well. Those developmental, during those developmental years, how emotional trauma can affect the development of a child's brain and cause them to have differences in executive functioning, memory, and stuff like this as well. Typically, all of these conditions are characterized quite differently, but there's also like a lot of overlap. So we see a lot of executive dysfunction, issues with attention, impulsivity, emotional and social problems as well, things to do with your motor skills, and various other presentations that have a lot of overlap. I think what's really interesting to me, and it's a slide that I took out for this presentation, but the overlap of diagnoses as well, and the co-concurrence of various conditions. As soon as you're diagnosed with one neurodivergent condition, the likelihood that you actually have another neurodivergent condition skyrockets as well. And so we see a lot of crossover. We see a new term that has been popping up a lot over the past few years is ADHD, which is a combination of autism and ADHD, which the two kind of go hand in hand, but also are very like polar opposite. And when you have a combination of both, it's a real battle between your brain, this impulsivity created by the ADHD, but need for like order and structure created by the autism as well. It's a real gnarly combination. We know from statistics that around 20% of the population are neurodivergent, and this is actually considered to be probably much higher. It's probably considered to be much higher than 20%. This is the underdiagnosed rate. We also know that both Indigenous Australians and Maori people are disproportionately more likely to be neurodivergent as well. And so when we look at the neurodivergent campus experience, we can start to think of, I guess, all of the stereotypical ways. I've just used ADHD here because that's my primary diagnosis, but we think of students and individuals as being easily distracted, always fidgeting, unable to sit still. But when we actually look below the surface, we see that there's much more to the iceberg than originally thought. And all of a sudden, this condition becomes overbearing and takes over your entire life. You have poor sense of time, this all or nothing type of thinking, things like choice paralysis, issues with sleep, maintaining relationships, relentlessly losing items. You can start to piece together how just all-encompassing a disorder like ADHD can become for an individual, especially when they're leaving home for the first time and coming to university, leaving school, even if they've managed to make their way through school and mask quite well, as I did. As soon as you get to university, those structures start to fall apart, and you start to, as I did, get exposed to all of these problems that maybe before you hadn't even noticed or had a lot of support around. And so some of the common and stereotypical challenges that we see, as I said before, are issues with time management, concentration, staying on topic, articulation, organization, balance, movement, everyday tasks really just all become this massive, massive task and a huge challenge for many neurodivergent folk. And so it begs the question, how does the neurodivergent experience impact the student experience? In every way. There is absolutely no way that the neurodivergent experience doesn't impact the life of our students. From the way that, from the hobbies that we take on, from the way that we remember your name, from the way that we forget to reply to your 22 missed phone calls, or the way that we're very slow at responding to emails because we might be down a rabbit hole trying to satiate our brand new hyperfixation. Every single way, every single aspect of our lives are consumed by the way that our neurodivergent condition affects our brain and affects the way that we think. So when it comes to student well-being, we look at neurodiversity and we see that the impact and the harms associated with it are quite huge, and they also exist in a lot of areas that we have already identified as struggle areas and that we're targeting as well. So things like poor academic outcomes, things like career and financial struggles, social isolation. We know that people with neurodivergent conditions are also more likely to experience mental health struggles as well. From self-reports, so this is a report called Closing the Gap, which was put out by Cubo in the UK last year. And it's got some really great insights into it. For example, self-reports from students say that they're 2 times more likely at struggling with basic academic skills when entering university than neurotypical people. And as I'm sure we're all aware, when we enter university, we're kind of just expected to know how to learn. We're never actually taught how to learn and how our brains learn. And so for neurodivergent folk as well, that just adds a compounding layer of challenge to their experience of university. I think it's also important to note that the link between neurodivergence, particularly ADHD, and other areas of harm such as addiction, alcohol, and drugs, there's such a huge correlation. I mean, managing ADHD well is already a challenging process, but it becomes more difficult because there are coexisting chemical and behavioral addictions in part of the picture. Many adults with ADHD struggle with addictive behaviors which are often unrecognized or untreated. And many reasons account for the addictions, for addiction amongst adults with ADHD. However, 2 general causes tend to come up again and again. Firstly, that adults with ADHD are more likely to self-medicate, particularly when they lack awareness or understanding around their ADHD biology and have not yet learned how to manage it well. And secondly, that many ADHD adults are drawn to thrill-seeking and novel experiences as well. And so I wanted to briefly go back to that story which I touched on at the beginning, my experience during the pandemic during 2020 and 2021. So the part of that story that I left out was that coinciding with my burning out in 2021, I had also lost control of my ability to moderate my drinking. And in college, I mean, that's a problem that we see again and again amongst students. I think that being in college probably exacerbated that a lot. But what I didn't know at the time was that my ADHD was massively contributing to why I was not able to manage my drinking so much. On nights out, I'd come back and I wouldn't be able to have just one drink or two drinks. It would be all or nothing, that all or nothing thinking that we were looking at before. ADHD is, I like to call it a disease of boredom. You're allergic to boredom, and that's because it's a dopamine deficit disorder. Your brain becomes addicted to these dopamine chemicals, these chemicals that release these happy hormones, and drinking releases dopamine in the body. It becomes addictive, and as soon as you get that reward chemical, you start to drink more and more and more. And I was acutely aware that my drinking had become a problem, and it was beginning to scare me, but I had no idea why, even when I was trying my hardest, that on a night out, I couldn't actually moderate my drinking. And so I think it's really important that when we look at our students and how they're doing, that we, when we notice a problem, that we don't just jump to judgment. One of the things that I love to say all the time is engage with curiosity before judgment. Because it very well may be the case, as was in mine, that the student is fully aware that there is a problem, but they just have no language, no understanding, no knowledge, and no awareness of how to actually address that problem within themselves. What they actually need in that moment is a point of connection and a point of empathy to have someone help them get through that problem. I think to summarize what we know is that when vulnerable groups are not meaningfully supported, their well-being outcomes are more likely to worsen. But we also know that neurodivergent people with neurodivergent conditions, it's not all doom and gloom, that they possess massive strengths. And when meaningfully supported and when empowered to make changes in their lives, to support themselves, neurodivergent individuals possess a wealth of strengths and unique abilities that can greatly enrich all of our communities. Our diverse ways of thinking often lead to innovative solutions and other creative ways to solving problems. For instance, those with autism often exhibit exceptional attention to detail and organizational skills, which can be invaluable in running and managing our events. Those with ADHD bring high levels of energy and enthusiasm, and the capacity to hyperfocus as well, which can be harnessed to drive vibrant activities within our community, which can be utilized to bring new ideas to a team as well. But I think mostly our resilience and our adaptability that many neurodivergent people develop in response to going through their challenges can foster strong leadership and strong advocacy skills, and something that amongst students in particular make them some of the most effective student leaders that I've had the pleasure of interacting with as well in the short few years that I've been in this industry. By fostering communities which recognize and cultivate these strengths and meaningfully support students with neurodivergent conditions, we're not only supporting those neurodivergent individuals, but we're also harnessing their potential to drive innovation and progress within our communities and make our communities better for it. So, how do we build inclusive and neuro-affirming communities? I put together 3 kind of ways, and while these are very much focused on the residential setting, I think the principles can translate to absolutely any setting, right? Whether that's your workplace, whether that's your home as well. The physical environment. I encourage everyone to do kind of a sensory audit of their communities. This includes checking out what the lighting is like. Are there diverse options of lighting? Bright lighting, dim lighting? What's the noise like? Where are the loud areas in your workplaces, in your communities, in your learning spaces? And where are the quiet spaces? And making sure that you have diverse options so that students who are neurodivergent have a place to actually retreat and and seek some space for quiet or for a busy environment if that's what they thrive off. Some neurodivergent individuals absolutely thrive off body doubling. And these responsive design choices. The Talking Stick magazine out of the US last year also put together this article on responsive design. I would encourage you guys to check it out. And it's all about how we can make our informal, in particular, learning spaces much more neuro-affirming and creating spaces that have a diverse range of both hypo and hyper sensory spaces. Something that I'm very proud of that we introduced last year at Grace is the sensory toolbox. It's a very simple addition. It's just a little box with a bunch of fidget toys in it, but it made a world of difference in our study areas. And it just goes to show that these solutions, they don't have to be massive and structural, that they can be small and they can be really easy to implement as well. I think the thing that surprised me most about the sensory toolbox is that the first time I saw it in massive use wasn't actually during study and while students were studying. It was when our rugby boys had taken over our library to watch the State of Origin, and they were all in there playing with those fidget toys. And it might have been on account of the multiple concussions, but I'm not sure. But to see it getting use was extraordinary. Culture and practices as well. Embracing neurodiversity within everyday practices. It does take intentional time and effort. And we look at these massive projects that we have within colleges, things like Orientation Week, things like our dining spaces and our meals. These are things that our communities center around. And essentially at the core of this is the principle of removing that sense of uncertainty and adding in that sense of flexibility. Implementing things like move-in checklists and telling students what they can expect from the get-go, as soon as they arrive at Orientation Week, removes that sense of uncertainty and makes them feel so much more confident when entering a new environment. I mean, entering a new stage of your life is nerve-wracking for absolutely anyone, but it's exacerbated for those with a neurodivergent condition as well. And that's the same goes for meals in the dining space, providing an advanced menu, removing that uncertainty. A lot of the time when we have events, we tend to wonder why those with sensory issues might not be attending our events. And to me, I don't actually think that it's because that they don't want to. I think it's because they don't have an awareness of what to actually expect. And so something else that we've done at Grace is start to, with all of our events, add sensory meters to our event posters and let people know this is a low sensory event, this is a high sensory event. And what that has enabled our students to do is to, when they see an event that they want to attend that's high sensory and they may not be able to cope with that, they actually give themselves permission to say, okay, I'm going to go along for 15 minutes and then I'm going to give myself permission to leave. And I'm going to reevaluate then. And that way they can still be engaged in the activity. We implement things like chill out zones and sensory rooms as well, so that they can still be part of the event, but that they don't have to engage in it fully for the entire time, right? They know what to expect. They have ways to engage that aren't, that are different just from the main event. And of course, education and awareness, increasing our understanding, increases our empathy around neurodiversity as well. Social support, empowering neurodivergent students to be self-advocating. I think this is really key, is that neurodivergent individuals, they know their brains best. And so we really need to get good at providing open doors for students who both are diagnosed or suspect that they might be neurodivergent. Getting a diagnosis, I mean, I'm very privileged to have a diagnosis of ADHD, but it was a long process and a very expensive process to be able to get to that stage. And it's one that a lot of people aren't able to access easily. For me, receiving a diagnosis allowed me to have some closure, allowed me to go back through my life and understand why, and start to put the puzzle pieces together of why certain things were the way that they were, why I struggled with certain things. But that compassion, that empathy can as easily be offered to someone who doesn't necessarily have a diagnosis of a neurodivergent condition as well. At the end of the day, we've seen the harms that are created by the lack of awareness around an individual's lack of awareness of their neurodivergent condition. And to me, offering that compassion and empathy, while they might not receive an official diagnosis for quite some time, putting a label to that, understanding their challenges and supporting them through that is much less risky than letting them go down a rabbit hole where they don't know what is happening within their brains. And be ready to listen and act when people come to you and say, this isn't working for me. Bring your students along for the ride. That's one of the things that I've really loved, especially stepping into this year. Last year, I focused a lot on the neurodivergent experience at Grace and was able to put together a lot of new initiatives. This presentation was one of those, and fortunate enough to be invited here. And I'm very happy now to know that right at this moment, we've got students who are planning the Chill Out Zone on their own for our big Grace at Home event on the weekend. And that we have empowered them to take this into their own hands and be advocates for themselves and be leaders within their communities and make sure that they feel safe, like they belong, like this is a community where they can be themselves and thrive as well. I've got some useful resources. I'm going to quickly skip over them. I can tell you more about them afterwards, but just in terms of time, I just wanted to finish on this. Our most useful resource, I think, is our students and the people that we know in our lives with the lived experience. They are our most valuable resource, and I think if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this session, it's that that connection, community, belonging, and empathy are really how we start to understand neurodiversity and start to create more inclusive communities where everyone can thrive. So thank you very much.